All right, let's jump right in. Imagine you're here in Texas. You've done your time, paid your dues, and you're ready for a fresh start,
Ready to move on.
Ready to move on. But there's this shadow following you,
Yeah,
your criminal record.
it really can be.
Makes it harder to get a job, find a place to live, even volunteer at your kid's school, all sorts of things.
Absolutely.
That's where these things called orders of non-disclosure come in. We're going to deep dive into this bill. Texas HB 2300, it almost totally changed the game on this.
Yeah, HB 2300, called the Wings Amendments, all about second chances, right? A bold move to make it easier for folks to get an order of non-disclosure, basically making it so those offenses, they don't show up on most background checks. Didn't quite make it through this time, but got to understand what it was trying to do, especially since we're seeing similar efforts gaining traction for the upcoming legislative session.
So we're talking way more than just a speeding ticket here.
Oh, yeah.
This was expanding it to misdemeanors, state jail felonies, even trying to open a way for some felonies to be sealed.
Big stuff.
Big stuff. So our mission today is to break down the differences, what the law says right now, and what HB 2300 was aiming to change.
Okay. Sounds like a plan.
All right, so let's start with the current law.
All right.
Texas Government Code 411.0735. You can seal your record? Maybe, but it's really limited.
Yeah, limited in scope, mostly applies to misdemeanors, and even then there's specific requirements. Got to wait a certain amount of time.
And there's certain things that are just totally excluded, like no matter how long it's been, DWI, forget it.
Nope, DWIs are out, along with certain assault charges, family violence.
Heavy stuff.
Yeah, the legislature, they consider those particularly serious, so less eligible for having the record sealed, even if time's passed, person's rehabilitated.
Okay, so that's how things stand now. Before HB 2300 came along, let's get into what this bill was trying to shake up.
Okay, let's unpack it.
What were the big changes it was proposing?
Two major things. First, shorten the waiting periods for non-disclosures for eligible offenses. Let people get on with their lives faster.
Right.
Second, and this is the big one, it wanted to open up the possibility of non-disclosures for some felonies. Right now, that's not even an option under Texas law.
Whoa, felonies in the mix, that is a huge change.
Big time.
So let's break it down. Offense by offense.
Okay.
Starting with misdemeanors, what kind of impact would HB 2300 have had there?
So right now, you're convicted of a misdemeanor, you successfully complete your sentence, you might have to wait 2 years before you can even apply for a non-disclosure.
Oh, wow.
HB 2300 wanted to cut that down, potentially way sooner.
That could make a huge difference for somebody just trying to, get back on their feet.
Absolutely.
Okay, what about state jail felonies?
Mm-hmm.
More serious than misdemeanors, but not as serious as those higher level felonies. What would HB 2300 have done there?
Currently, state jail felonies, you're looking at a 2-year waiting period under 411.0735, HB 2300. Wanted to shrink that down to just 1 year. So those folks, they could potentially have their records sealed much quicker.
Yeah.
Opens up a lot more doors, jobs, housing, education, the whole 9 yards.
So there's this pattern, right? HB 2300 trying to cut down those waiting periods.
Yeah.
It seems like it's recognizing that people, they can turn their lives around and they deserve a chance, without their past always hanging over them.
Right, second chances.
Yeah, second chances. But now let's talk about the really big change. Felonies. How would HB 2300 have handled those?
This is where it gets really interesting. HB 2300 proposed a tiered system for felonies. The idea being the more serious the felony, the longer you gotta wait before you can even think about applying for a non-disclosure.
Makes sense.
So for a third-degree felony, someone would have to wait 7 years after completing their sentence before they could even ask for a non-disclosure.
7 years. That's still a long time, but right now there's no option at all for a third-degree felony.
Nope.
So it's still a huge shift.
Definitely.
What about second-degree felonies?
For those, HB 2300 was suggesting a 10-year waiting period.
Wow.
Substantial, yeah. But at least it offered some possibility down the line, assuming they meet all the other requirements, of course.
Right. So even with these longer wait times, the fact that you could potentially seal a second-degree felony conviction, that's a major change from how things are now.
No doubt.
Really emphasizes the whole second chances thing.
Yeah.
What about the most serious ones, the first-degree felonies?
Well, HB 2300 went even further. It actually suggested a 12-year waiting period for those.
12 years.
It acknowledges how serious those offenses are, but it still hangs on to the idea that even in those situations, people can change.
Yeah.
rehabilitation is possible, and individuals should eventually have the chance to move past that part of their lives.
This is complicated stuff.
Oh, it is.
I bet there are really strong arguments for and against all these changes.
Absolutely.
We're going to dig into those in the next part of our deep dive for sure.
Looking forward to it.
But before we wrap up this segment, what are some key things you think our listeners should be thinking about right now?
Well, I think the big takeaway is the difference, right?
Yeah.
The stark contrast between how the law is now, super limited options for sealing records, versus what HB 2300 was trying to do, really expanding those options, especially for the felonies.
Right.
It didn't pass this time, but these ideas, they're important to grasp as we head into a new legislative session.
Absolutely. And for our listeners out there, this is a call to action.
Yeah.
If you're passionate about this second chance thing, you believe in redemption, stick with us. We'll keep you updated on legal-gangsta.com.
Legal-gangsta.com.
About how you can get involved in pushing for these changes. The fight for HB 2300, that might be over. But the fight for a fairer system, that's just getting started.
It is. Welcome back. Picking up where we left off, Texas HB 2300 and all the changes it was aiming for, especially with the felonies.
It's definitely got people talking, for sure. I think it's important for folks to understand both sides, you know, the pros and the cons.
Oh, absolutely.
So let's start with the arguments for expanding these non-disclosures, especially for felonies. What were the big points that the people supporting HB 2300 were making?
Well, one of the most compelling arguments is about, actually giving people a real chance at redemption.
Yeah.
Supporters of the bill, they were saying, look, once someone's served their time, they've shown they've rehabilitated, that felony conviction, it shouldn't keep punishing them forever.
Right. It's like recognizing that people, they can change, right?
Yeah.
Grow. That a mistake they made years ago, it shouldn't define their whole future.
Exactly. The idea is you seal those felony convictions, shield them from public view, and people, they can break free from that stigma.
Yeah.
It opens up so many doors, better jobs, stable housing, even just feeling like they belong in their community.
Right. It lets people truly move on, contribute to society without being judged for their past all the time. I imagine supporters also talked about the economic benefits of this, right?
Yeah.
Expanding non-disclosures.
Oh, for sure. When you've got people with felony convictions, but they're able to really participate in the workforce, it helps everyone.
Yeah.
They can use their skills, earn a decent wage, support their families.
Right.
Stronger economy overall, and you might see less recidivism too, right? People with stable jobs, a sense of purpose, they're less likely to end up back in the system.
So from a bigger picture perspective, expanding non-disclosures, it's kind of a win-win.
I'd say so.
Helps people get back on their feet and boost the economy. But of course, it's not all sunshine and roses, right? There are definitely concerns about expanding this, especially for felonies. What were some of the main points raised by people who weren't so keen on HB 2300?
Yeah, the big one was public safety.
Right.
Opponents were saying if you're hiding felony convictions, it could be harder to track people with a criminal history, and that puts communities at risk, potentially.
Right, I can see that.
They were really emphasizing transparency, you know, in the justice system, saying the public has a right to know about someone's past, especially when it's a more serious offense.
So it's about keeping a certain level of accountability, making sure any potential risks are out in the open. I'd imagine victims' rights were a big part of this debate too, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Victims of crimes, they often rely on the justice system to get some sense of closure, of accountability.
Right.
Opponents of HB 2300, they were worried that expanding these non-disclosures, especially for felonies, it could downplay the harm that victims experienced and make it harder for them to feel like justice was actually served. They really wanted to make sure victims' rights were protected, their right to be informed about what's happening with the offender, to have their voices heard through the whole process.
Man, it's a tough situation.
Yeah.
Trying to balance recognizing that offenders can turn their lives around, but also making sure victims are heard and their experiences are validated. Sounds like there are really good points on both sides. So how do we even begin to figure out how to approach this?
It's one of those things, there's no easy answer. It's got to be case by case, taking into account the offense, what the individual has done to rehabilitate themselves, and how it all might impact the victims and the community.
Yeah, that's complex.
This whole HB 2300 debate really highlights just how hard it is to find the right balance, Justice, accountability, second chances. It's tough.
Okay, so we've heard the arguments from both sides.
Right.
It's clear This issue has so many different layers, affects so many people. But let's make it a little more personal. How might these changes have affected real people here in Texas?
Okay, so imagine someone, let's say her name's Sarah.
Okay, Sarah.
Convicted of drug possession a few years back. Probably fall under a state jail felony in Texas.
Okay.
She's done her time, completed a drug treatment program, been clean ever since, working hard to get her life back on track, but that felony conviction, it just keeps getting in the way.
I can imagine. So frustrating. Like she's being punished over and over for something that happened in the past, even though she's obviously changed.
Exactly. Now, under the current law, Sarah would have to wait 2 years after finishing her sentence before she could even try for a non-disclosure.
Right.
But if HB 2300 had passed,
Yeah.
that waiting period, it would have been only 1 year.
Wow, that 1 year could make a huge difference for her.
Absolutely.
It could be the difference between being stuck, dead-end jobs, limited opportunities, and finally being able to get a good job, a better place to live, maybe even go back to school.
It's all about removing those obstacles, giving people the power to rebuild their lives.
Yeah.
Now, a non-disclosure, it doesn't erase the past completely, but it would hide that conviction from most background checks.
Right.
So Sarah could present herself as who she is now, not who she was years ago.
It gives her that real shot at a fresh start. Okay, let's switch gears a bit. Let's say there's a guy, David, convicted of theft a few years ago. We'll say this one's a third-degree felony. He did his time, finished parole, paid back the victim, and has been a model citizen since then.
Okay, so with David, under current Texas law, there's no way for him to get his record sealed no matter what.
Really?
No matter how much time goes by, how much he changes, it's just there. But HB 2300, that would change things for him.
So even though it was a felony, HB 2300 was saying, hey, people like David, they deserve a chance too.
Right. That's the idea. With the changes proposed, David would have had to wait 7 years after finishing his sentence before he could even ask for a non-disclosure.
7 years, yeah, that's a while.
It is.
But it's a big step from what we have now, where there's literally no hope for someone in his situation.
It's a big shift in thinking.
So it's recognizing that rehabilitation, it takes time. And even with more serious offenses, there should be some path forward, some way to eventually move on.
Right.
I imagine the 10-year wait for second-degree felonies, the 12 years for first-degree, those would be viewed the same way, right?
Absolutely, yeah. The tiered system in HB 2300, it's acknowledging that not all felonies are created equal, but it's still holding on to the idea that people can change, even after a serious offense, and they should have a chance to show that.
Thinking about these stories, it really makes HB 2300 more than just some legal stuff. You see the real people behind it, the real impact this debate has.
Absolutely. It's about real lives.
Real lives, real second chances.
You got it?
Now, I know we can't forget that not everyone's on board with this whole expanding non-disclosures thing, especially when it comes to felonies. We talked about those concerns: public safety, victims' rights, transparency in the system.
Right.
Those are valid points, and they deserve to be considered seriously.
No doubt about it. It's a complicated issue, and there are good arguments on both sides. At the end of the day, it's about trying to find that balance, a system that promotes both accountability and redemption, recognizing that people are complex and they can change.
This is a conversation that needs to keep going, right? We need to be empathetic, understanding, willing to hear each other out. And that's what we're trying to do here on the Deep Dive. Give our listeners the information they need to form their own opinions to get involved in these discussions.
Couldn't agree more.
Okay, so we've looked at both sides of the argument, considered how this could affect real people, and touched on this delicate balance between justice and second chances. But I feel like there's still more to unpack, right?
Oh, definitely. In the last part of our deep dive, we're going to zoom out even more, look at the bigger picture, the history of non-disclosure laws.
Okay.
How they've changed over time, where they might be headed in the future. Stick around for that.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Texas HB 2300, exploring the world of non-disclosures. We've been focused on how this bill was trying to change things up for misdemeanors, state jail felonies, and even some of those more serious felonies.
Lots of ground to cover. We've really been looking at this tension rate between holding people accountable and giving them a chance to redeem themselves. It's a tough one.
Absolutely. HB 2300 trying to expand access to second chances, but then there's those concerns keeping people safe, thinking about the victims, transparency in the system. It's a lot to consider.
Oh, yeah. A whole lot.
So as we wrap this up, I think it's good to zoom out a bit, look at the bigger picture. Like, how did we even get to this point where we're having this debate about non-disclosures in the first place?
You're right. Historical context is important here. This whole idea of sealing or wiping away criminal records, it's not new. Started gaining traction in the US back in the late 1900s. People were becoming more aware of the long-term consequences, what happens after a criminal record.
So it wasn't just about serving your time anymore. It's like, even after you've done what you're supposed to do, that record can still haunt you. Makes it harder to get a job, find a place to live, even go to school.
Exactly. And even things we might take for granted, like voting. So there's this growing movement trying to address what they called collateral consequences.
Collateral consequences. That's interesting.
Yeah, it's basically all these legal and social restrictions that can stick around long after a sentence is over. It makes it so hard for people to reintegrate, to build a stable life.
So non-disclosure laws, they came about as a way to try to deal with these collateral consequences, kind of a way to let people move forward without their past always tripping them up.
Exactly. And as people have become more aware of these consequences, there's been more of a push to expand who can actually get a non-disclosure. Many states, Texas included, are starting to take a more nuanced approach, moving away from that one-size-fits-all system, realizing it doesn't really work when it comes to criminal justice.
Right, right. So Texas historically has been pretty strict with non-disclosures, but HB 2300 was a pretty big attempt to change that, especially for felonies. Where do you think this is all headed? What's the future of all this?
I think this debate is going to keep going. It's going to keep evolving as we try to figure out criminal justice reform, how people re-enter society after being incarcerated, and how a criminal record can impact someone's entire life. There's more and more recognition that a past mistake shouldn't define you forever, and that giving people ways to rehabilitate themselves and be part of the community, it benefits everyone.
It's about second chances.
Yeah.
Realizing that people can change and actually contribute to society in a positive way.
Exactly. And you know what else I think will play a big role in all this? Technology.
Oh, interesting.
With the internet, social media, it's harder than ever to escape your past, even if your record's been legally sealed.
Like a digital scarlet letter.
Right.
That follows you everywhere you go online. That's going to be tough for people trying to rebuild their lives.
Oh, absolutely. So I think we're going to see more and more efforts to address how easy it is to find criminal records online. We need ways to protect the privacy of people who have had their records cleared, and we need to be talking about how that information is used.
It sounds like the future of all this non-disclosure stuff is going to be shaped by so many things. Social attitudes, legal changes, even technology. It's always changing, trying to keep up with the times.
It is, and it needs constant conversation, a willingness to look at it from all sides. It's not about forgetting about accountability. It's about figuring out how that fits with redemption, how we recognize that a criminal record doesn't have to be a life sentence.
Powerful stuff. For folks out there who are dealing with this directly, what advice would you give them?
Stay informed. That's number one. Non-disclosure laws, they're different everywhere. Every state has its own rules.
Right.
So you got to know what the specific laws are in your area. Don't be afraid to get advice from a good lawyer who specializes in this kind of thing.
It's about knowing your rights, knowing what options you have, and getting help from people who understand the system.
Exactly. And this process, it can be tough. It can take time.
Yeah.
But it's often worth it. Getting your record sealed, it can open up so many doors, give you a real chance to build a new future.
It's about taking back your story, defining yourself by who you are now, not by mistakes you made in the past.
Exactly. And remember, you're not alone in this. There are organizations out there, advocates who are dedicated to helping people with criminal records and fighting for their rights. Look for those resources. Connect with people who understand what you're going through.
I think for those of us who haven't been directly affected by these laws, this whole conversation has shown just how important it is to be empathetic, to try to understand and to really question what we think we know about crime and punishment. It's not always simple.
Absolutely. It's something that touches all of us, and we need to be open-minded, willing to listen and learn from each other.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We started with the specifics of HB 2300 here in Texas. Then we zoomed out and looked at the bigger picture, the history of these non-disclosure laws, how society views them, and what the future might hold. We talked about the arguments for and against giving people second chances, saw how this could affect real people's lives, and really grappled with that tricky balance between justice and redemption.
We did. And I hope it's given our listeners something to think about, maybe even some hope for those who are looking for a way forward.
I hope so too. And remember, the fight for a better, fairer criminal justice system, it's not over.
It keeps going.
If you want to stay up to date on non-disclosure law reform, if you want to know how you can get involved and make a difference, head over to legal-gangsta.com. That's legal-gangsta.com. We'll keep you in the loop.
We will.
That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for listening, everyone. Until next time, keep those minds open, those hearts compassionate, and remember, second chances matter.
They do.